She called me an ugly cow in French at my own kitchen table. She thought the words were private. She didn't know I understood every syllable. It began, as most family dramas do, with too much cheer and too much faith in first impressions. David had that look in his eyes, ears flushed, smile too wide to be casual, when he brought Camille home the first time. He introduced her as if reading a playbill. Camille, from Marseille, speaks 3 languages, works in marketing, loves my husband's old records. She had a small, practiced laugh that made the room feel like it belonged to someone better dressed, someone the world could accommodate without effort. I was taken. I'd been taken by David himself, by how serious he was about finding someone kind after Robert died, by the way he seemed steadier when she was around. Maybe that's why her polish disarmed me so easily. We had dinner the second week she visited. It was a simple meal, roast chicken, green beans, a mess of mashed potatoes, that my hands arranged out of habit rather than ceremony. The table was the same one Robert and I had eaten at for 30 years. The napkins were the linen he used to iron on Sunday mornings. I set out the small china plates we kept for guests because David liked when things felt nice. Camille complimented the roast in a French-accented whisper, and I told myself I liked the gentleness of that whisper. Halfway through the main course, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then stood and moved toward the living room as if to take a private call. I thought nothing of it. People take calls, we let them. Only later would I replay the room in my head and count the small choices that let me overhear what I wasn't meant to hear. She sat on the edge of the couch, phone to her ear. She must have thought the curtains and the low hum of the refrigerator made the living room a safe place for secrets. He had that habit of pocketing his own phone and trusting that distance ensured privacy. David went to clear the plates. The clatter of cutlery masked the beginning of her sentence, but then clear as a bell I heard a French word that stopped the air between my ribs. Vache. Not a polite word, not a slip. The voice that had complimented the roast now said something that sounded like vache-led, ugly cow. She laughed afterward, a short, pleased little sound, as if the idea of that insult made the plan she was describing sharper, more efficient. My hand tight enough around the plate to blanch my knuckles, the ceramic slipped from my fingers and shattered against the sink. The noise snapped the small domestic bubble. David and Camille looked at me. I smiled, because that was the only thing I knew how to do when confronted with something I didn't yet understand. Inside, a flint dropped. I wanted to ask, to accuse, to demand to know what she had called me and why, but I saw David's expression. He was buoyant, trusting. He was in love. To raise suspicion in that instant would be to push away the son who still needed me. I swallowed the words. You learn, as you spend your life in a house with other people, that not every rupture should be sealed at once. Some fractures need mapping before you try to fix them. I could have told him the truth immediately. David, she just called me a name in French on the couch while she arranged to use you, and watched him either defend her or crumble. I had seen both outcomes before with friends and neighbor families who stumbled into scandal and ruin. I thought of David's stubbornness, how he didn't listen to warnings politely. I thought of how, if he believed me as soon as I spoke, he might double down to prove me wrong. There were too many risks to blurt accusations across the table like a dropped fork. Instead, I let the broken plate lie in the sink and kept my voice light. Are you all right? I asked, as if asking about nothing more dangerous than a clumsy hand. He laughed and kissed the top of my head. Everything's perfect, Mom. His shoulders relaxed. He dried the cutlery with the informal way he had, stood and walked into the other room, where Camille's laugh still lingered like a fragrance. The next morning, I did what you do when you suspect something you have no proof of. You educate yourself. I had Claire, my niece, who worked in visa services and who knew the bureaucratic skeleton of what immigration fraud looked like. I called her and tried to keep my voice steady while I described, in a way that kept my son's dignity in the center, the words I had heard. Claire did not laugh. She was practical. There's a checklist for this, she said. Not a perfect one. Nothing's perfect. But there are signs you can look for. Short marriages, inconsistent employment history, addresses that don't match, unusual wire transfers, people who pivot through identities. I told her exactly what I had heard. She coached me with a clinician's patience, the kind of calm that says, I do this for a living, and yes, I have seen this before. She set the right name for the pattern immediately, marriage fraud. When she suggested that I document everything quietly and consult a private investigator for corroboration, I was surprised at how fast my resistance softened. It sounded in her tone like caution. It was not hysteria, it was method. We moved deliberately. We did not move alone. I told Claire, if there is anything here, I won't ruin David's life with a leap to conclusions. She advised me on what could be checked publicly and what would require care. Social media histories, employment records, property records, public marriage filings, and crucially, connecting with someone who knew how to dig without stepping over legal lines. If this is a professional, you'll need a professional, she told me. But don't go rogue. Talk to a lawyer. Protect yourself and the evidence. A lawyer sounded formal, excessive, almost dramatic, but it was the right word. I called the attorney who had once helped my husband with a trust. His assistant remembered my name and the old Thompson account politely. The attorney himself, when I told him the story, let the silence fall between sentences like a weight. "Margaret," he said, not unkindly, "you need facts." He recommended a private investigator he trusted, who had a record of working with families and law enforcement, who respected both privacy and the law. He emphasized no tricks, no entrapment, document everything legally, and if there's criminal activity, we'll work with authorities. So I hired Marcus Webb. Marcus was not the television sort of PI. He wore neutral colors, a soft voice, and had an office filled with shelves of unremarkable files. He brought along an unobtrusive manner and an appetite for proof. The first time he sat with me, he opened a small leather notebook and asked me to tell the story from the beginning, exact words I had overheard, the time, where the phone had been, who was in the room, what I had done afterwards. He did not say you were right, nor did he say you were wrong. He asked for details, for copies of texts, for access to anything David would not mind him reviewing given the circumstances. Marcus worked in a patient cadence. He started where any competent investigator would, publicly available records. He read profiles and followed breadcrumbs. He examined Camille's LinkedIn profile and found a glossy resume that didn't quite hold together. Job titles that shifted like stage props. 1 month marketing coordinator in Marseille, the next digital strategist in New York, with a roster of clients that left no verifiable trace. References that seemed oddly protective or curiously thin. A social media history that leapt from city to city in the space of months, without the anchor of friends or family photos you would expect from someone claiming roots in France. Within 2 weeks, Marcus sent me a small envelope marked with evidence, screenshots, printouts, and annotations. He said, "There's a pattern here, Margaret. Not proof of a crime yet, but enough to ask the right questions." He showed me a marriage certificate, for example, from a state I didn't recognize immediately because the name on it didn't match the one Camille used with us. He found more than one marriage record, some abortive, ended quickly, with notes, divorces, settlements, short in time, recurring like a rhythm. He found bank transfers too, wires sent to accounts and names that should have belonged to Camille, but routed through the same intermediary in another state. I asked him details, and he answered calmly. Some transfers looked like support payments, others looked like a pattern of creating payment pathways that might not be for ordinary domestic reasons. Marcus emphasized that he was not a prosecutor, he was a collector of threads. Taken alone, each thing is explainable, he said. Taken together, they aren't. One of his findings put a cold weight in my chest. Multiple passport numbers linked to similar photographs. Different names, different countries of issue, but the face was the same. There were aliases, 3, that traced back to the same biography at certain times. Marcus explained that identity fluidity like that was often used to facilitate movement through immigration systems and to create an impression of legitimacy. He also traced prior marriages that had ended with settlements. The settlements were not necessarily criminal, and the records were cautious not to demonize anyone. Marcus treated the documents like a cartographer treats rivers, mapping where they flowed, not judging the weather that had shaped them. He gave me the names and dates and told me to consider them as data points, not evidence of guilt until authorities corroborated them. When he spoke of Christina Marsh, yes, that name, he did so carefully. Marcus had discovered an alias pointing to that name long enough to make him uneasy. That name connected to a string of short relationships and a pattern of financial transactions that did not match the profile of a young woman trying to build a life quietly. He had also found the name Camille Dubois attached to accounts and documents that did not originate in Marseille, but in various registries here. Somebody has been very good at dressing up an identity, he said. Hearing the name Christina Marsh made my throat close. The Louise and Robert Thompsons who had raised us were careful people. To imagine someone attempting to slide in and take advantage of us for citizenship and money felt vulgar in the bone. Yet it was impossible to extrapolate motive only from a ledger of transfers. "You have to be prepared," Marcus said at one point. "If you're going to stop a marriage that is potentially being used to obtain residency through fraud, you must work with authorities. If you do anything public without them, you may harm a case and you'll certainly harm relationships, maybe irreparably. This isn't a soap opera, it's a legal puzzle." I continued to balance 2 things that felt like contradictory instructions: protect my son and protect the truth. I met with the attorney again. He advised formal steps:
updating certain legal documents, clarifying where family assets would or would not be accessible should a marriage happen, and making sure that David understood, in a general way, the advisability of not rushing into signing anything with full information. He was careful, as a lawyer should be, to say he could not predict outcomes, that each fact would have to be verified. Marcus did not work alone. He coordinated, when necessary, with authorities who told us, without offering legal conclusions, what the investigative path would look like if a criminal pattern was established. He advised that the right moment to involve law enforcement was when they had a demonstrable paper trail that an agency could act upon.
Until that moment, the work would be private, procedural, and dull, more spreadsheets than drama. I remember the nights that followed as a kind of double life. By day, I was Margaret, the woman who organized pills into Monday through Sunday boxes, who watched the yard, who made sure the mail was sorted correctly. By night, I became an archivist of suspicion, sorting printouts into labeled folders, reading Marcus's reports until words blurred. The house began to feel like it contained two mirrors of me, the warm mother that David remembered, and the cautious investigator learning her new trade. There were moments when my own conscience attacked me. Had I betrayed him by not telling him immediately? Would he have wanted to know sooner, even at the risk of denial? I lay awake thinking about the night my husband fell ill, how the only person who could have saved him was myself once the doctor stepped away, and I thought that protective instinct does not retire with age. It becomes, if anything, sharper. I told myself, sometimes with a clarity that surprised me, that you cannot pick your child's battles for them forever, but you can, sometimes, buy them time. One afternoon, Marcus called and asked if he could bring a photograph. He was a man who preferred small details, he told me. He liked to place a face on a theory. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with the photograph balanced between us like a small, solemn altar. It was a passport photo, same face, cropped, even small marks on the ear that matched the woman who had poured the wine at our dinner. Marcus had blown up other images and placed them on a board. "See how consistent the mannerisms are," he said. "The smile is rehearsed. The eyes are responsive in the same way across these files." He showed me the timeline. 3 identities, 3 different names, transient addresses. He had printed copies of emails where Camille had requested certain payments to be made to accounts that later funneled into other names. He mapped several short marriages and settlements, things that raised flags for the system if someone had the patience to look for them. "This is not conclusive on its own," he cautioned, "but if we line it up with a live attempt to gain status through marriage, and if the authorities can show intent rather than just opportunity, then we have something to act on." I wanted to ask, why us? Why my son? Was David a mark because he was gentle, because he had money, because he wanted to help somebody? Marcus gave me a look I would later recognize as what investigators give grieving relatives. It was not unsympathetic, but was anchored in the discomfort of fact. "Vulnerability attracts pattern seekers," he said. "A family that is open and trusting is not a weakness. It's just a target sometimes." That word, target, stung. I began to see our small house as an open ledger. Lists of what we had given casually. Trust, money lent to a nephew in a pinch years ago, David's willingness to sign forms for his mother that he thought would mean convenience. I also had to reckon with the truth that protecting someone can look like overreach, like an intervention that strips autonomy. There were nights I imagined him furious with me, a son with a slammed door who accused me of not trusting him. I feared that as much as I feared actual fraud. The moral weight was heavy because both outcomes were possible. I could be a protector or the architect of the wound. We moved to secure the legal scaffolding, the way one would stabilize a leaning wall before removing a rotten beam. The attorney suggested careful, quiet changes, update directives, ensure certain accounts require dual signatures, make sure that any immediate attempt to access family assets would be met with legal safeguards. No secret bank freezes, no traps to humiliate. "We act before anything is signed," he said. "We document, we advise, and only if we have proof do we escalate." Escalation for us felt terrifying and necessary in equal measure. Marcus proposed a plan: expose the pattern in a controlled way that would produce incontrovertible evidence without theatrics or cruelty. He spoke about a staged dinner where the woman, if she truly was the person we now suspected, would likely reveal herself in ways that would be caught on record. He recommended presenting people as the parents and making introductions that would clarify identities.
He insisted that any such gathering had to be coordinated with authorities. He did not say gotcha with relish. He said it with the dryness of a professional avoiding legal pitfalls. You cannot arrest a feeling, he told me. You can only present the paperwork. At this point, I should say something about humility. I had never wanted my life to turn into a thing someone outside my family would narrate. But when Marcus laid out the options and Claire gave me a checklist of the signs that screamed fraud in the quiet, it became clear that if someone had been manipulating David into marriage for the sake of papers and access, then stopping it was in a way mercy. We planned the sting. Careful word. Sting felt theatrical, and I refused that as a motive. We called it a test dinner, an evening where we would introduce Camille to the parent she had mentioned in passing as a way to measure her intentions and reactions. The attorney arranged to be on call. Marcus requested we allow him to record interactions lawfully, to document what occurred in a way that would be admissible. Claire volunteered to be present in a peripheral manner, to corroborate dates and particulars if needed. We asked and were granted cautious cooperation from an ICE contact, who said that if there was enough evidence of an attempt to commit immigration fraud, they would act accordingly.
She did not promise arrests. She promised that proper paperwork and procedures could follow if a case was established. Her name, Agent Sarah Chen, came up in those preparatory conversations as a point of contact who took such matters seriously and handled them with discretion. I will be honest, as I agreed to all of this, I felt like someone who had put on a suit that didn't quite fit. The idea of inviting strangers and watching for a revelation felt like theater of the most painful sort. Yet the alternative, do nothing and perhaps watch my son marry into a lie, seemed to me a worse kind of negligence. We rehearsed in small ways. Marcus advised how to keep the tone civil, how to avoid baiting any individual into saying something they might later claim was entrapment. The attorney reminded us to document every step, every image, every witness. Claire translated certain red flags into plain instruction. Check marriage license filings the day after a proposal. Record who pays deposits for wedding planners. Watch for sudden changes in a spouse's stated employment. There were moments, practical and almost absurd, that I remember with a kind of embarrassed humor now. The selecting of a spare phone that would not be David so we could document the dinner. The way I ironed the napkins more carefully than I had in months because the visual normalcy mattered. The nervousness that made my souffle of charm mask a kind of armor. I even dusted off phrases of French. My high school classes had been thin but serviceable, and practiced saying small things, harmless pleasantries, knowing that the language itself had been the instrument that first revealed her. I found myself repeating the title of this story in my mind. My son's fiancée insulted me in French at the table. She didn't know I understood. Those words became a small drumbeat. Language is revelation. I told myself I had listened because I already loved my son and wanted to understand. I told myself I had the right to know whether the world bending toward him was a partnership or a performance. In the days leading to the planned dinner, I saw David less like a child and more like a man with a life I could no longer wholly control. There were moments when he looked at Camille with a softness that bordered on devotion. There were times he forgot my name in favor of the new rhythm of his life. He spoke of engagement in a way that made my chest ache with both joy and a premonition I could not name. I slept poorly. The house felt like it sat between two doors, one that opened to trust, another to caution. The night before the planned gathering, my hands shook slightly as I set place settings. The memory of the plate smashing was a low thud in my bones, another domestic disaster that now served as a lesson in restraint. We had assembled a small team. Marcus, who would be collecting evidence, Claire, who would be watching logistics, the attorney, who would be on call, and me, who would play hostess and, if necessary, witness. There was also the possibility that law enforcement agents would be present, unannounced, to keep the pretense intact. Agent Chen had said she had to see the evidence for herself before deciding to act, and that she would move carefully. As I polished the silverware, rehearsing the innocuous banter I would use to put everyone at ease, a small, ridiculous thought struck me. How many crimes have been uncovered by the ability to laugh at a table? How many saved relationships began with a well-timed question or a visible gesture that made an imposter misread the room? I did not want a spectacle. I wanted clarity. I wanted to avoid shattering a family if the suspicion proved false. But the plate in the sink reminded me we were past the point of naive trust. By then, Marcus had returned with more than documents. He had a plan for the evening. The fake parents, a phrase I had to repeat so as not to be reduced to trembling, would be local actors, not detectives, chosen because their mannerisms would fit a believable conjugal history. We had recruited them with careful boundaries, no provocation, no entrapment, only a staged introduction whose goal was to elicit natural conversation. Everything, Marcus stressed, would be recorded within the law. I remember putting a small folded note into my pocket that evening with a sentence I wrote for myself: honor David's dignity. It was the tether that kept me from imagining the worst as inevitable. I spoke to him before the dinner in the most neutral way I could muster. I said, "Camille mentioned inviting her parents for dinner. She suggested next Saturday. Would you be all right with a small family meal?" He said yes, delighted in the way people are when they believe a milestone is imminent and sweet. He did not know, or perhaps he suspected nothing, that the meal was now a test. There is a kind of violence in preparing to test someone you love. It feels like a betrayal, even when you think the betrayal prevents a worse one. I tried hard to keep the moral contours clear in my mind. We would act legally, with facts. The aim was not to humiliate, but to protect. Still, there was the ache of imagining his face when the news came, however it came, and the knowledge that for as long as I lived, he might look at me in a way that remembered the night I chose secrecy over immediate disclosure. The day we set everything into motion, the house hummed with an ordinary domesticity that felt like camouflage. I set a table that smiled at the past Robert and I had made. Small flowers in a low vase, the same napkins, the good china that had been too careful for every day. I practiced the line in French to break the ice in case Camille tried to switch languages in front of her parents. "Bienvenue chez nous," I would say, "welcome to our home." I thought of the first insult, the private ugliness that had been caught in my ears, and I resolved that language would be, once again, a way to understand and to reveal. The doorbell rang as I adjusted the placement of a dessert fork. My heart did a strange, quick thing, less like a beast and more like a memory. I smoothed my dress, wetted my lips, and walked to the door. I opened the door to the sound of polite laughter, too practiced, like a recorded track. Two people stood on the porch, careful with the script of civility. A man with a soft, grandfatherly smile, and a woman whose eyes watched everything that moved. They wore neutral clothing, ordinary enough to pass as parents arriving for a quiet dinner. I stepped back and let them in, the familiar weight of the house pressing against me like an ally. My hands remembered how to be hostess without revealing the seam of my nerves. They kissed David's cheek and extended warmth the way people who have rehearsed affection do. "Nous sommes ravis," the woman said, and cupped my face as if to anchor herself to family. I kept my French light, just enough to return a phrase, and not so much that it sounded like a performance. "Bienvenue chez nous. I'm so glad you could join us." The woman answered in English, but her manner carried the cadence of someone who knew which language to choose at which advantage. Camille, Christina, smiled as if nothing were the matter, then introduced the two as her parents, Pierre and Helene. They sat near the window, opposite the side of the table where I had placed David, as if to keep him near the center of a circle. On the surface, everything unfolded like an ordinary, maybe slightly awkward, family meal. Conversation brushed the expected items, work, small compliments, the weather, but language kept curling like a live wire where I had first discovered it. At one point, in a lull while wine passed from hand to hand, the mother spoke to Camille in a low French phrase whose translation I caught without effort, a remark about settling quickly, about getting things done. I let the sound fall over me like rain and took a slow breath. I had practiced a way of being neutral and open. I laughed in the right places. I asked David questions about his job the way a mother does, curious, a bit indulgent. I asked Camille about her childhood in Marseille in the same tone that seemed to say I believed what she told me. My plan was not to force the issue with theater, but to give opportunity for the truth to be spoken under ordinary pressure. If she was an honest woman, the night would be a welcome introduction. If she was not, this would be a place where the cracks might appear. At dessert, with coffee cooling in small cups, the conversation narrowed the way a stream channels toward a culvert. Marcus's calm voice, hidden in a recording device I had agreed to, captured the soft clicks and the murmured phrases. I could not listen while pretending to look around the table. I let my attention rest on the conversation at the center, making small comments, steeling myself to notice the angles more than to take any position. Then, almost casually, the father mentioned a prior marriage, not a detail that would by itself confirm anything, but his reference included a surname that didn't match the mother who sat with him and the oddness of a cousin in Florida who had handled paperwork. The details were irregular. I felt, in the split second when names and places crossed like trains, the shape of something, an irregularity that demanded more than curiosity. Camille's voice changed when she answered. It was faster, smaller, like someone who had rehearsed an apology and then realized the timing was wrong. "It wasn't like that," she said, in French first, then in English. "We were young. It was complicated."
That switching, French to English to control the temperature of a statement, was the same technique she had used the night she had called me a name and thought it private. The pattern, it was there again, language used to create safe pockets of unaccountability. My heart thudded. I looked at David, who looked radiant in the warm light, unconcerned as people are when they rely on the kindness of others to fill gaps in their knowledge. I wanted to reach out and touch his hand and tell him this was theater. Instead, I touched nothing and breathed slowly. The plan was to give the small discrepancies room to create the evidence Marcus needed, organic, not manufactured. After coffee, as plates were cleared, the father reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, an old family shot, he said, to show David. It was a prop, but it was also a test. The man's hand trembled in a way actors would emulate when asked to seem heartfelt. He passed the photograph to Camille, who took it and studied it with what I hoped was empathy. She traced a finger over one figure and said to no one in particular, "We must hurry. Date's approaching. Everything must be set." Those last words were small and careless, but Marcus's recording caught the cadence, and the legal observer in the ice contact took notice. They were not the shouted plans of an espionage agent. They were the efficient language of someone careful with timing. Agent Sarah Chen, when I later heard from her, told me the phrase registered as the kind of scheduling detail people in her line use to infer intent. It was, she told me plainly, a sliver in a larger pattern. What followed unfolded faster than I had imagined. At a moment when the room had a lull, and David was smiling at something the father had said, a woman across from him spoke with the warm composure of someone with nothing to hide. Agent Chen leaned forward, resting her hand on a napkin as if she were only adjusting it.
Then she did something she had practiced in training. She revealed herself calmly, with credentials shown and a tone that did not seek to inflame. "Agent Sarah Chen, ICE," she said, and in her voice there was the weariness of someone who had stood in rooms like this before, and also the alertness of someone who knew how little drama and how much paperwork made a case. The table did not explode. Instead, there was a pause, like the hush after a bell is struck in a church. People watch how others react in a pause. David's face went pale in the way a sheet loses color in shadow. Camille's smile faltered for the fraction of a breath that reveals a seam. Agent Chen did not shout accusations. She produced a folder with documents, copies of marriage records, banking transfers, alias names. She spoke in plain sentences about evidence and process, pausing to allow the room to absorb the weight of what she said. Christina, who for most of the evening had been Camille, laughed then, not a nervous laugh, but something colder, like someone who had rehearsed a confession for an audience and had misjudged the room. "Oh, sweetheart," she said in English, leaning back in her chair as if to take away any sense this was anything more than business. "You all are making a very big fuss over what could have been such a lovely life. I'm not ashamed of playing the part. People marry for many reasons." There was an arrogance to the words that felt like salt poured on a fresh wound. Agent Chen began to read from the folder, references that did not check out, bank transfers routed through intermediaries, multiple names attached to the same face. Marcus, who sat quietly at the edge of the room with a legal pad and a neutral expression, added corroborative notes. The fake parents sat motionless, doing their part in the choreography we had rehearsed, to be introduced and to be normal. They had no part in the legal process beyond being witnesses to the interaction. David's reaction did not surprise me in the way it broke my heart. He rose to his feet quickly, chair scraping, voice shaking, as most men do when the ground beneath them reveals a sinkhole. "What are you doing?" he demanded, and there was a hurt in the question that was not just about the arrest or the documents, but about the deepest betrayal, that someone he loved had been using him. I did not join the chorus then. I had rehearsed silence the way a pianist rehearses scales, because the wrong note could ruin the entire passage. All I did was place my hand under the table near his. He did not take it. He looked at me as if I had been an invisible conspirator, and there was a violence to that look that cut deeper than any of the documents on the table. "How could you?" he asked me later, when words found land, but in that first moment he stared at me like someone understanding a parent is fallible. Christina's laughter peeled away and masked itself in sarcasm. "You think I say things?" "Do you think I would explain everything in front of your family?" she said. And then, in a voice that was not meant to be heard beyond the room, but that Marcus's recording captured, she said the words that had been whispered too many times. "Names can be borrowed, papers can be smoothed." When Agent Chen confronted her with aliases, she replied with the sort of ease that signaled a practiced denial, and then an odd sudden forthrightness. Yes, Christina Marsh, she said when asked, barreling a truth into the room like a thrown ball. I have used other names. It is business. It was as if the woman collapsed into the role of the villain she feared people would make her. There was no melodramatic confession. There was instead a cold-eyed inventory of utility. Names, transfers, opportunities. She said with a half smile, "It is the way of the world. People like what is offered to them." That statement, part rationalization, part contempt, felt like a counterattack on the agony we were all living. David's fury at me that followed sealed the immediate rupture. He left the house that night with his coat, the way people leave spaces that suddenly feel like a foreign country, and I remember standing on the porch and watching the taillights pierce the darkness. He did not speak. He simply drove away. I had expected anger, perhaps, aimed at the woman who had lied, but the son I loved had, in that first stunned hour, instead directed his fire at me. I had been the architect of the deception in his eyes, because I had not told him sooner. I had protected his future in a way that looked like betrayal. I will not pretend the arrest was a moment of triumph. There was the necessary legal formality of handcuffs and reading of rights. Christina, once called Camille, was escorted from the room with a confidence that suggested she knew the playbook for exit. Agent Chen later told me, in those terse, practical phrases law enforcement uses, that the arrest had been made based on intent, supporting documents, and the planned contact with the intermediary accounts. She did not discuss evidence beyond what was on record. She emphasized that the aim was not to humiliate, but to enforce the law. After the handcuffs, Christina made a remark, the kind of thinly veiled defeat that still had venom in it. She turned toward me and said with disturbingly calm eyes, "You will regret this, Margaret." It was both a threat and a reflection of the kind of contempt she had for the people who had tried to stop her scheme. I felt my face go hot and cold at once. There was a cruelty in a person who thought that name-calling and subtle means were junior to the ultimate winning of the prize she wanted. For a week, the house was a place of echoes. David stayed away. He called once, his voice low and broken, telling me he needed time and that he felt like a fool. I said nothing that might widen the gap, and that silence lasted longer than I had expected.
Friends called, some in outrage on my behalf, others in sympathetic sorrow for my son. Our attorney fielded questions from authorities and guided me through the paperwork and what the arrest would mean in terms of a pending investigation. Marcus continued his work, now focused not only on building evidence of fraud, but on tracing the underlying paper trail to other names. It was in those subsequent days that Christina delivered her last unwanted gift. In a phone call from jail, I was told she had the privilege of a few minutes to speak. She said with the same coldness she had shown in the house, "You should know the real Camille exists. I borrowed her name years ago. She won't be happy." The receiver went dead after that, a deadline sealing an unfinished sentence. Marcus, when I met him at his office, put a folder between us. It contained a lead he had been cultivating, a set of digital traces pointing to a real Camille Dubois in Marseille. The name had been used, he said, as a kind of costume, real on passports, unreal in practice. He had found some small, scattered references that suggested the real Camille existed and that she may have had her identity lifted. "It's not uncommon," Marcus said, and the way he said it made me feel I had stepped into a geography of human theft I had not known existed. People in vulnerable places, young women with thin documentation, can be targets for identity theft. It ruins their lives differently than the people who use their names. I felt the news like a second flow. Here was my son's would-be fiancée, arrested and exposed, but the damage had a further arc. An innocent woman in Marseille had been robbed of her identity. The moral ledger had multiple columns: crime, prevention, and damage to the innocent. I felt the weight of responsibility expand in surprising ways. I had not only tried to protect my family, I had also been an inadvertent participant in a process that uncovered harm to a stranger. If we had stopped a fraud, we had also been handed, as one of the consequences, the duty to try to repair the harm to the real Camille. I remember the moment I decided to help her as a quiet flicker of imperative that became a plan. Marcus told me he could try to contact the real Camille through channels he trusted in France, legal professionals, and a small investigative partner he knew in Marseille who handled identity theft cases gently. Claire used her contacts at the State Department to advise on the diplomatic channels we might use to find the real Camille. Our attorney reminded me that this was not merely a charitable act, but a step to right a wrong that had rippled across oceans.
When Marcus finally emailed a series of documents with a name and a small address in Marseille attached, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief.
The address was modest. The woman connected to it had a child and photographs, a history of local employment, and a world that did not include the gowns and the social media gloss the imposter had used. We arranged, carefully and with legal prudence, for Claire to make an initial contact through an embassy channel. Claire wrote a letter and asked a local social worker in Marseille to make a personal visit to confirm that the woman's identity had been used without her consent. It took weeks for replies to arrive across the ocean. When they came, they were small and human. A photograph of a woman at a market stall, a text message that said a woman named Camille had been told her passport numbers had been used without her knowledge, that she had discovered odd bank holds, and a claim on a social benefit she had never received. The woman's name, when we finally spoke, real Camille, was followed by a sobbing laugh that sounded like a person who had been both relieved and terrified at the same time. She wrote to say she had long suspected something had been wrong with her records. She had been told she should watch her credit. She had tried for years to have these anomalies corrected without the means to affect the U.S. systems where her name had been used. I booked a plane within a week. There was an urgency to the trip that felt less like heroics and more like a responsibility to stand before an actual person, the way one stands before truth. When I arrived in Marseille, the city was wet and bright, the salt air carrying a different kind of language than the one that had first warned me in my kitchen. I took a taxi to a small apartment near the port, where a woman named Camille met me at the door with a look that was both wary and kind. She was younger than I had imagined. Her hands were calloused in a way that told me of work rather than glamorous travel. She wore a plain sweater and had laugh lines that made her face easy to trust. We sat at a small table with coffee and croissants, and she listened to my fumbling explanation about identity theft and the woman who had used her name. Her French was easy for me to follow, and her English was bright and direct. When I told her gently that her name had been used in ways that could have harmed her, bank accounts opened under her number, documents filed that could be confused with her records, her face went white. She pressed a palm to her chest and said simply, "No, not me. I am not that woman." Her pain was immediate and personal. This was not an abstract injustice, but a wound that had complicated her life in small and sharp ways. Camille told me about small humiliations, a letter from a U.S. bank she had no account with, demanding documents, a phone call from a debt collector who had the wrong number, a social benefit claim that denied her because of paperwork that had nothing to do with her. She described the practical barriers she faced when she tried, from France, to correct records in places across the world. She had been told by officials that the systems were not easily navigable for someone without resources or language skills. Her voice carried the exhausted dignity of someone who had survived by making peace with daily inconveniences and had never expected the international dimension of identity theft. Sitting across from her, I felt the smallness of my earlier triumph in the face of this woman's daily struggle. Here was a human being whose bank, if left uncorrected, could be associated with another country's legal matters, with immigration processes, with the sort of harm that extends beyond inconvenience to the crushing of opportunity. I also felt a stirring of something else, an imperative to repair the wrong, not as an abstract legal outcome, but as a personal restitution. We began, slowly, to do what we had promised ourselves we would. We documented everything. Marcus coordinated with local investigators in Marseille, who assisted Camille in filing official statements and in placing markers on her records. Claire liaised with the U.S. Embassy and provided communication templates and the names of people in French institutions who could help. Our attorney drafted letters to financial institutions explaining the case and requesting freezes where needed. We took actions that were procedural and patient. Statements, notarized affidavits, copies of passports matched against the falsified documents. It was administrative work that felt, to a woman who had been wronged, like an act of reclaiming. When I returned to Austin with a plane ticket that felt like a promise, I carried with me a folder of stamped documents and a photograph of a real Camille smiling with relief. I also carried the knowledge that this would not be solved overnight. Identity theft is a long and bureaucratic war, but she was no longer unknown to us. She was a person whose name we had borne witness to, and that mattered. David, gradually, came back into our lives with a guardedness that took weeks to soften. I did not rush him. Marcus told me that the ruptures in such situations often required time and simple acts, consistency, not grand gestures. I wrote him letters without expecting immediate replies,
And when he did answer, he spoke in choppy sentences about trust and betrayal and the humiliation of being used. Those conversations were hard. He accused me with the directness of someone who expected an infallible parent of theft. You took my right to choose by deciding that I could not see for myself. He said that in his pain, he could not separate the woman who had lied from the mother who had hidden her own intentions. I owned my misstep. I told him as candidly as I could that I had believed that protecting him from a life of legal entanglement and false promises was paramount. I thought I was buying you time, I said once, voice small and shaking.
I thought I could gather the facts and keep you from making a mistake that would be hard to undo. He answered that he did not resent the fact I tried to protect him. He resented that I had decided for him. The difference was the space between a decision and consent. Over the following months, we tried to build trust in smaller increments. Marcus continued to track down leads in the U.S. Victor, the investigator in Marseille, helped Camille correct local records. Claire pushed for embassy support wherever the bureaucracy allowed, and our attorney oversaw the legal scope of what was publicly shared. In practical terms, that meant the imposter's arrest moved through an investigative process, while the real Camille worked to clear her name. It also meant that David spent long afternoons with me, where we sat in the living room and did not speak of the case at all, allowed the domestic quiet to return, and sometimes laughed at the small absurdities of life. Those afternoons mattered more than any argument. And then, in a way neither of us expected, something of the old groove returned with time. David began, cautiously, to ask about the real Camille's life. The curiosity was not the same as the desire that had once flared for the imposter. It was measured and kind. He wanted to know what her days were like, what she liked to cook, how she laughed. I arranged for a video call, and the first conversation between David and the real Camille was stilted, then warm, then curious. There was a humility in Camille that disarmed him. She did not seek to take the place of the woman who had tried to pass herself off as her. She merely wanted to tell the truth about herself. When she described Marseille, its markets, and the way the light fell on certain stairways, David listened as if hearing a new song. He apologized, in a small way that felt like a gesture and not a guarantee, for having been part of the moment where another person's life had been risked. The relationship between David and the real Camille did not move like a lightning strike. It moved like a tide that keeps coming in gradually, each wave reshaping the shore. They corresponded, they video called, and when the administrative protections allowed, he flew to Marseille to meet her properly. He traveled not as a lover seeking adventure, but as a son bringing an apology, and as a man who wanted to understand who the real woman was. They walked the port together. They ate oysters from stalls and laughed at language mistakes. They talked long into the evening about family and the things that mattered. There was no rush, no engagement ring at the end of the first night, no sudden plan for a wedding at home. There was instead a patient unfolding, the kind that rebuilds trust brick by careful brick. Months later, David and Camille married in Provence. The wedding was small, family, a few friends, and a woman I had once thought of as my son's fiancée, but now knew as someone with a truth to defend. We stood under a plane tree in a courtyard, and the air smelled like lavender and bread. There was a ceremony that was both tender and practical. Cassandra, the officiant, spoke of names and the gravity of promises. David looked at Camille as if he had discovered a country he longed to know, and that she was a gentle and stubborn place therein. I stood to the side and held my breath in a way that felt like prayer. After the wedding, in a small reception under string lights, David came up to me and took my hand. His eyes were wet, but not with the anger of that first night. These were tears that softened the edges of the year behind us. He did not absolve me with a single sentence, and I did not ask for mercy. We had learned, painfully, the costs of love and intervention. "You were trying to protect me," he said quietly, "but I'm glad you did what you did in the end. I'm glad you found the real Camille." His words felt like a bridge being rebuilt, not erased. The marriage did not erase the memory of the woman who had been arrested. Christina's name remained in court files, and her case proceeded on its own legal timetable. I did not gloat at her fate. Imprisonment or judgment is never a spectacle to celebrate. It is a sobering administrative fact. My relief was not in the handcuffs, but in the knowledge that the mechanisms of law could at least address the wrongs that had been performed. Any sense of triumph I might have felt was tempered by a knowledge that a life, David's, Camille's, Christina's, had been hurt by choices in a system that allows for such misuses.
If there was a lesson threaded through the months of this ordeal, it was the odd humility of learning that protection sometimes costs what it seeks to preserve. I had thought of my decision as a shield. It turned out to be a scalpel, precise and potentially healing, but also capable of cutting where one intended only to cauterize. I had to accept that I had been both protector and, for a while, the bearer of secrecy that wounded. The reconciliation with David was not a single event, but a series of small acts. Simple meals without agenda, a daily text at noon to ask about his day, and the mindful decision to listen rather than steer. I also learned that identities, like family narratives, require careful tending. Helping the real Camille regain a sense of security in the face of bureaucratic indifference was a gift that changed me more than it did her. She, in turn, taught me to see the world with a stubborn softness, to register the bureaucracy of grief, and to respond with human patience. When she came to Austin for the wedding, she and I walked through the farmer's market, and she chattered in French about spices and recipes, and I felt grateful for the chance to know her as herself, not as a name stolen from some ledger. In the months and years that followed, I sat with the residue of complicated choices.
My grief at the loss of Robert had long ago settled into an ordinary ache, one that paired with the new understanding that being a mother does not mean being infallible. I had protected and also coerced, in a restrained sense, and that tension accompanied me like a companion I could no longer ignore. I tried, as best I could, to live with the humility of having acted from love and still caused harm. People sometimes ask me if I would do it again. My answer is never simple. I would do what I learned to do differently. I would consult earlier, I would involve counselors and lawyers sooner, and I would try, where possible, to preserve my son's autonomy while still gathering the facts. The temptation to act alone is strong when you fear for your child. The discipline required to act with restraint and in cooperation with the law is sadly rarer than we imagine. Language remains for me a motif of revelation. That night at the kitchen table, when she called me an ugly cow in French, I realized how language can be a key to hidden worlds. It revealed not only insult, but strategy, the cadence of a liar more comfortable with an alien tongue. It also led me, ultimately, to real people, a real Camille, who deserved to be known and protected from the ripples of a crime committed far away and carried into our home. I think now about the line between justice and compassion. When the law moves, it does so in structures and forms that may not heal. When we, as neighbors and family, intervene, we must do so with humility and with an eye to repair, not merely to punish. That is why finding the real Camille and helping her reclaim her name mattered as much as stopping the marriage. Justice without repair is an incomplete story. A final note: if you're watching and this story has touched something in you, whether it's a memory of being deceived or the gnawing fear of protecting someone you love, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe if you'd like to hear more first-person stories like this. We're a community of imperfect people trying to get it right. I close that chapter now with a quiet gratitude for the slow repair that followed. David and Camille live not in a tale of sudden rescue, but in the patient work of building a life together that is honest and careful. They have children now, 2 small ones with bright, inquisitive faces, and I watch them on visits and remember the plate that shattered in my hand, and the lesson that sometimes the thing that saves is also the thing that severs. My son's fiancée insulted me in French at my own kitchen table. She thought the words were private. She didn't know I understood every syllable. That fact was the hinge. It led from a private indignity to a painful investigation, to an arrest, to the discovery of a stolen life, to a trip to Marseille, and finally to a wedding in Provence.
Along the way, I learned that protection without transparency can wound, that legal remedies are blunt things that need human repair, and that the simplest acts, listening, admitting error, and helping to fix what you can, matter more than an act of exposure ever will. If you have a story where language revealed something you'd rather not have known, or where you had to choose between immediate revelation and a careful investigation, share it below. We heal in the telling, and sometimes what feels like solitude is just a story waiting for the right ears.